The cold clang of metal echoed as the handcuffs snapped tightly around Judge Gates' wrists. Two officers, their stance rigid and unwavering, pulled him from the judge's bench, his former throne, where he once ruled with unchecked authority. Flashbulbs burst in rapid succession, illuminating his ashen face as he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is ridiculous." Behind him, Pam Bondi stood motionless, her hand resting firmly on a stack of documents, her sharp gaze unwavering. The courtroom was engulfed in a suffocating silence. The jury sat frozen in shock, the hurried scribbling of reporters punctuating the stillness like raindrops on glass. At the defendant's table, Robert Lawson, a high-profile businessman, gripped the edge of the table, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes darting in panic. There were no explanations. No final words. Only the weight of the moment, a kingdom of power crumbling in an instant. Share the name of your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another gripping story, crafted just for you. If you're a dog lover and enjoy heartwarming canine tales, comment number 1. Now, let's rewind time and uncover what led to this fateful moment. The screen fades, the lighting softens, shifting to Pam Bondi stepping into the courtroom just hours earlier. A heavy tension hung in the air, the piercing stare of Judge Gates locking onto her, a silent declaration of war. Judge Gates was infamous for his ruthless, unpredictable courtroom demeanor. His severe tone and unexpected rulings had intimidated even the most seasoned attorneys. Pam Bondi was no stranger to pressure. She had spent years battling in some of the most grueling trials in America. But today, as she entered Gates' courtroom, a different kind of tension settled in her chest. Before him lay a case of profound significance, one that threatened to shake the very foundation of government ethics. The defendant, a wealthy real estate developer with deep political ties, stood accused of funneling public funds into private projects. The evidence was overwhelming. Bondi was prepared. What she hadn't anticipated was the cold, deliberate hostility emanating from the bench. Gates flipped through the case files at an agonizingly slow pace, allowing the silence to stretch, an intentional display of dominance. Without lifting his gaze, his voice cut through the air, icy and dismissive. "Ms. Bondi, I hope you have something worthwhile for me today. Or should we just skip to the part where you waste my time?" A few muffled chuckles rose from the defense's side of the courtroom. Bondi stood firm, unshaken, her expression unchanged. She had faced intimidation before. But this was different. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case concerns the misuse of taxpayers' money, and my duty is to present the truth as clearly as possible." Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayers' money, huh? Now that's an excuse I haven't heard before in one of these pointless cases." Her jaw tensed slightly, but her voice remained composed, each word delivered with careful precision. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't believe allegations of serious corruption are pointless." Their eyes locked, one gaze calculating and cold, the other unwavering and resolute. But before she could continue, Gates cut her off again. "Ms. Bondi, spare me the lecture. Get to the point. I don't have all day to watch you put on a performance." A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but the tension in the air was palpable. Judges were known for being strict, but this felt personal. Bondi took a measured breath, steadying her heartbeat. She knew exactly what Gates was doing, trying to rattle her, to put her on the defensive. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She picked up a folder, carefully flipping it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly show." "Ms. Bondi." Gates' voice cut through the room, sharper than ever. "Do you always drown people in paperwork, or is this just how you hide your own incompetence?" The words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. The shift in atmosphere was instant. The defense attorney smirked, relishing the moment. Reporters in the back exchanged excited glances, sensing a headline in the making. But Bondi stood her ground, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that men like Gates only truly won when they saw their opponent flinch. Silence. A deliberate pause, just long enough to assert dominance without needing to raise her voice. Then, with quiet precision, she placed the folder back on the table, clasped her hands in front of her, and met his gaze head-on. "Your Honor, if you wish to continue making this personal." She tilted her head slightly, her voice even but razor-sharp. "I would be more than happy to request a recess if you need time to work through any professional concerns." Her words were calm, devoid of hostility or disrespect, but firm enough to send a message: she would not back down so easily. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Judge Gates' lips. A smile? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. But he wasn't finished yet. "Oh, I have no concerns, Ms. Bondi. I simply know a weak case when I see one." This time, the reaction in the courtroom wasn't just murmurs. A few audible gasps broke the tension. Someone whispered something in hushed outrage. This was not how a judge was supposed to conduct himself. Pam Bondi could feel the weight of the stares around her, shifting between her and Gates, as if watching a match unfold. But she wouldn't fall into his trap. No raised voice. No arguing. She simply adjusted her blazer, smoothed the papers in front of her, and met his gaze head-on. "Then I believe we should let the evidence speak for itself." But as she spoke, something flickered in his eyes, not just arrogance or disdain, but something deeper. A flicker of unease, so brief it was almost imperceptible. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't just another display of power in the courtroom. Judge Gates wasn't merely being combative for his own satisfaction, he was hiding something. He didn't know it yet, but she had seen it. Bondi had handled high-stakes trials before, but this felt different. Gates wasn't just presiding over the case, he was playing a dangerous game, deliberately trying to discredit her in front of the court. But why? She could feel his stare, scrutinizing every word, waiting for a misstep. His fingers tapped idly against the bench, his smirk a calculated dare, inviting her to push forward, to see how far she'd go. And she would. Her voice remained steady, precise. "Your Honor, these documents clearly outline a discrepancy in budget allocation. The defendant's company received nearly 3 times the originally approved state funding, and none of it appears in the official financial records." She leaned slightly forward, gesturing toward the screen behind her, where financial reports were displayed in undeniable clarity. "Now, if you take a closer look here." "Ms. Bondi." Gates interrupted again, his voice laced with that same familiar condescension. "Believe me, I have no desire to disrupt your impassioned presentation, but I think we've all seen enough numbers for one day." Bondi turned to look at him, then glanced back at the screen. Now, he wasn't even trying to hide it. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of this case." "Exactly," he cut in with a smirk. "And yet, I see nothing here worth wasting this court's time over." There it was again, wasting time. He was trying to bury the case before it even had a chance to begin. Behind her, she could hear the faint rustling of papers, the quiet exchange of worried glances between her colleagues. They sensed it too. Bondi tightened her grip on the pen in her hand, flipping to the next page in the file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to." Denied. The room fell into a stunned silence. Bondi lifted her gaze, her expression carefully measured. There was no mistaking the skepticism in her voice. "I haven't even stated the motion yet." "And yet, I'm certain it would be meaningless," he said smoothly, his expression unreadable. Then, Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his tone dropping into something quieter, something almost mocking. "Let's be honest, Ms. Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting, and suddenly, you're crying corruption. On the other side of the room, the defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit, offered the faintest smirk. He didn't need to say a word. Gates was doing his job for him. Bondi exhaled slowly, tempering the heat rising in her chest. When she spoke, her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, are you rejecting my motion before you've even heard it?" The silence stretched, longer than necessary. Then, with a cold finality, he answered. "I'm rejecting the idea of indulging this charade any further." Now, the room wasn't just tense, it was shifting. People were paying attention. Heads turned. Even the reporters at the back were scribbling furiously. Bondi caught the eye of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, wearing a dark blazer. Her brow was furrowed, lips pressed tightly together. She wasn't the only one. That was the thing about arrogance, it always drew an audience. Bondi straightened her shoulders, her tone steady. "Very well, Your Honor. Let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, pressing a button to move to the next slide. "This document, obtained through a subpoena, clearly shows that." "Ms. Bondi." Gates' voice had changed. The sarcasm was gone. Something in his tone made her hesitate. When she turned, she noticed he was no longer reclining in his chair with that smug indifference. Now, he sat upright, fingers interlaced, his mouth set in a tight, rigid line. Something had shifted. "Step closer." It wasn't a request. A flicker of hesitation passed through her, but she set her papers down and walked toward the bench. The room fell into an expectant silence. When she reached his desk, he lowered his voice, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach, Ms. Bondi." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "I'm sorry, what exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean," he enunciated each word carefully, "there are some battles not worth fighting." The words hung in the space between them. Bondi leaned in ever so slightly, her voice soft but unwavering. "I don't intimidate easily, Judge Gates." His jaw tightened, just a flicker, but she caught it. A restrained irritation. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back to her table. But that exchange had been enough. Settling back into her seat, her mind raced. This wasn't just a display of power. That had been a warning. Carefully veiled beneath the authority of his robe. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting resistance, perhaps even hostility. But this was different. Gates wasn't just biased. He was protecting something. Or someone. Bondi calmly adjusted the stack of files in front of her, ensuring that not a single thought registered on her face. She could feel the subtle movements from her team beside her, shifting slightly, waiting for her reaction. She didn't give them one. Instead, she simply looked up, locking eyes with the judge who was now watching her carefully. "Your Honor, I would like to continue presenting my evidence." Gates didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, considering just how far he was willing to push her. Finally, he relented with a flat, dismissive remark. "Proceed. But keep it brief." She ignored the taunt. Reaching for the next document, her voice returned to its calm, measured tone. "This document is the contract signed between the defendant and the City Planning Board, detailing the projected costs of the development. As you can see, the total declared budget is just over $2 million. She paused. Then, deliberately and precisely, she placed another page onto the projector. "However, these are the internal records from." Bondi placed another document onto the projector. "This file shows that the actual amount transferred was nearly double the initial figure." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room before carefully laying another page onto the desk before her. "And this is the approval signature for that transaction, signed by." She stopped, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of the moment drop. Judge Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it fractured. A rustling of papers, hurried whispers. Pens scratching furiously against notepads. At the defense table, the attorney sat up straighter, his smug confidence evaporating. And Gates, for the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, was unreadable. Bondi let the silence stretch just a little longer before she spoke, her voice crisp and deliberate. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction linked to the defendant? A calculated move. She didn't have the whole story, not yet. But she had enough to make the ground beneath him shift. Finally, Gates moved. A slight adjustment in his chair. His fingers laced together, knuckles white from the force of his grip. That evidence is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head, her gaze steady. Why? It was improperly obtained. She let his words linger in the air, let him feel them being dissected, examined. Your Honor, this document was acquired through a subpoena issued by my office. A small twitch at the edge of Gates' nostril. Then it was mishandled. I am ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered in this trial. This time, the reaction wasn't just from the audience. The jury. The court clerk. Even the bailiff near the door shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible change in posture, in expression. Bondi crossed her arms, her voice remaining calm. Are you aware that this is a public courtroom? That there are multiple journalists here? That every person in this room just witnessed you dismiss critical financial evidence without legitimate cause? A small muscle in Gates' jaw twitched. That's enough, Ms. Bondi. She didn't blink. Didn't move. Then, slowly, she sat down. And that was when she did something that changed everything. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small recording device. Set it on the table. Pressed play. A voice filled the air, low, gravelly, unmistakable. Handle it. I don't care how. The static from the recorder crackled, then the voice continued. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those records. Silence fell over the courtroom. Not the tense, expectant silence from earlier, but something deeper. The silence of truth. No whispers. No murmurs. Just the collective realization rippling through the room, an invisible shockwave. Judge Gates didn't move. Didn't breathe. And Bondi, she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Because now, everyone in that courtroom had heard him. And the real game had only just begun. The recording clicked off, leaving an emptiness in the air, heavy and suffocating. No more hushed speculations. No more exchanged glances of doubt. Just the crushing weight of the undeniable. Bondi remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the recorder as if daring anyone to deny what had just played. No one did. Across the room, the defense attorney finally blinked. His once unshakable confidence had fractured. The arrogant smirk was gone. Replaced by something closer to fear. He turned to his client, a powerful businessman, a man who had built an empire on backroom deals and political protection. And now, he was pale. Judge Gates cleared his throat, but the sound was dry, strained. Ms. Bondi, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but... She cut him off, her voice sharp as ice. That is not the question you should be asking. She pushed the documents forward for all to see. These were no longer just numbers. No longer just paperwork. This was evidence. This document shows that the actual amount transferred was nearly double the initial figure. She let the words settle, pressing their weight into the air. Then, slowly, she placed another page on the desk. And this, the approval signature for that transaction, signed by. She let the sentence drift, let the moment stretch, let every person in the room finish the thought themselves. Judge Gates. The room fractured. The creak of chairs. Pens scratching across notepads at a furious pace. Eyes darting between one another in urgent, silent exchange. At the defense table, the attorney no longer wore his smug grin. And Gates. He didn't move. He betrayed no reaction. But his silence spoke louder than anything else. Your Honor, Bondi said evenly, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction linked to the defendant? She didn't have the full story. Not yet. But she had enough to shake the foundation beneath his feet. Finally, Gates moved. A subtle shift in his chair, his fingers intertwining, knuckles widening under the pressure of his grip. That evidence is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head, her gaze razor-sharp. Why? It was improperly obtained. She let the words hang in the air, allowing him to feel the weight of every scrutinizing stare in the courtroom. Your Honor, this document was obtained through a subpoena issued by my office. A subtle twitch flared at the edge of Gates' nostril. Then it was mishandled. I am ruling it inadmissible. It holds no legal standing and will not be considered in this trial. The room was no longer just tense, it was shifting. Eyes turned. Heads swiveled in unison. The jury. The court clerk. The bailiff. Everyone in the room felt something cracking beneath the surface. Your Honor, do you realize this is a public courtroom? That there are multiple journalists here? That every single person in this room just watched you dismiss crucial financial evidence without legitimate cause? A small muscle in Gates' jaw twitched. That's enough, Ms. Bondi. She didn't blink. Didn't move. Then, slowly, she sat down. And at that moment, she did exactly what she had planned all along. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small recording device, set it on the table, and pressed play. Handle it. I don't care how. The static buzzed through the speakers, slicing through the silence like a blade. Then, the voice continued. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those records. No one breathed. No one moved. For the first time in the entire trial, Gates was no longer in control. Your Honor, Bondi said smoothly, her voice cutting through the heavy air, the real question here is, who were you speaking to? Gates' fingers clenched tighter. This is absurd. This entire trial has turned into a circus because of your theatrics. A circus? Bondi echoed, her tone light, almost amused. I'd call it clarity. Finally, we're getting some transparency in this courtroom. The tension coiled tighter. She let the silence stretch, let him feel the heat of it pressing in. Then, she reached for another document, sliding it forward with deliberate ease. Your Honor, this is a transcript from a legally sanctioned wiretap, collected during the course of our investigation. She tapped a finger against the title on the page. It confirms everything that was just heard in that recording. Gates stared at the document but didn't touch it. Officer Reynolds, would you mind reading the highlighted section aloud? The officer hesitated for just a second, then picked up the document. His voice was steady, but the words sent a shiver through the room. We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything concrete yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never reaches a courtroom. A sharp intake of breath from the jury. I move to submit this document into evidence, Your Honor. A flicker of movement, Gates' eyes darted toward the exit. A small gesture, but one the entire room caught. For the first time, he was no longer in control. He was thinking about running. But it was too late. Overruled, he barked. I'm sorry, what did you say? This trial is over. Gates' voice was higher than usual, a telltale crack in his composure. I will not allow. Judge Gates, I don't need your permission. Bondi turned, offering the smallest nod. barely perceptible. A door swung open. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each step pounding like a nail being driven into his career. "Judge Gates, you are under arrest." Gasps erupted across the room. Reporters lunged forward, cameras flashing, phones raised, recorders already rolling. The jury sat frozen. The defendant, the powerful businessman who had believed this trial was nothing more than a formality, was utterly, completely silent. Gates didn't turn. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, staring down at the bench in front of him, as if by remaining still, he could will this all away. But reality had caught up with him. Two officers approached, flanking Gates on either side. One reached into his jacket pocket. The other withdrew a pair of handcuffs. "This is ridiculous." His voice had lost its usual sharp edge. It was frayed, drained of authority, as if he already knew there was no undoing this. The officer didn't react. "You have the right to remain silent." And for the first time in his career, Judge Gates actually did. The cold click of metal echoed through the room as the handcuffs locked around his wrists. Across the courtroom, Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She had won. Pen scratched furiously against paper. Fingers typed at lightning speed. The jury, who had been sworn to impartiality, could no longer hide their shock. But Pam Bondi remained still, her expression unreadable. This was not a moment for triumph. This was not revenge. This was justice. At last, Gates found his voice. "You can't do this." His voice had dropped to a near whisper, as if even he no longer believed his own words. The officer securing his wrists didn't so much as flinch. "Sir, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You will have the opportunity to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked at his wrists, his face reddening with rage. "This is disgraceful. I am the law in this courtroom." Bondi stood, adjusting her blazer, her voice sharp as steel. "Not anymore." His eyes snapped to her. For the first time, the arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something else. A flicker of fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but Gates resisted. "This is a political setup. This is..." Bondi shook her head. "This is accountability." The courtroom fell silent once more. A lifetime of unchecked power, reduced to this moment of collapse. Gates turned, scanning the gallery. His gaze flickered over every face, searching for someone, anyone, to speak up, to protest. But no one moved. No one said a word. Because this wasn't a mistake. Not far from where he stood, the defense attorney sat motionless, his face ashen. And the defendant, the powerful businessman who had once believed his influence and connections made him untouchable, wasn't faring any better. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. Bondi let her eyes rest on him for a brief moment before turning back to Gates. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "if you have something to say, I suggest you save it for your arraignment." Gates' mouth opened. Then closed. Because now, there was nothing left to say. The officers began leading him toward the side door. But before they reached it, another voice shattered the silence. "Wait! Wait!" A chair scraped violently against the floor as Robert Lawson shot to his feet. His wide eyes darted frantically between Gates and Bondi, his voice unsteady. "This is getting out of hand. We can negotiate." Bondi turned, arching a brow. "Negotiate?" He swallowed hard, visibly unraveling. I mean, there's no need to escalate this. Let's be reasonable." She studied him for a long moment before taking a step forward. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson." His mouth opened, but no words came out. She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over him, deliberate and unhurried. "Why is that?" He shook his head quickly, forcing a thin, unconvincing smile. "Nervous?" "No, no, this is ridiculous. You don't actually believe Gates is guilty, do you?" Bondi let the question hang in the air. Then, slowly, she spoke. "What about you?" Silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The officers resumed walking, leading Gates through the door. When it clicked shut behind him, another hush settled over the courtroom. But this time, it wasn't tension. It was something else entirely. It was recognition. The truth had been buried for too long, and now, it was finally being unearthed. Bondi glanced at the jury, then at the now empty judge's bench. Finally, she turned to the defense table. "I believe we still have a trial to complete." But everyone in the room knew, this was only the beginning. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. It felt lighter, as if the weight of a decayed system had just been lifted. As if, for the first time in years, justice might actually stand a chance. In the blink of an eye, Judge Gates was gone, escorted out in the cold bite of handcuffs. But the aftershocks of that moment lingered in the air, like the final note of an unfinished symphony. Pam Bondi sat back down, quietly straightening the stack of documents before her. The trial wasn't over. Not yet. But its greatest obstacle had been removed. She turned toward the defense table. Robert Lawson was unervingly silent. The smug confidence that had once been a fixture on his face was gone, replaced by something far more calculating. He was assessing the damage. His safety net had been ripped away, and he knew it. Bondi leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Lawson, would you like to proceed with today's trial, or would you prefer to discuss a plea deal?" His jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." Bondi smiled faintly. "No, Mr. Lawson. This is justice." He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You think taking down one corrupt judge is enough? You think that means you've won?" Bondi didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, let his words sink into the charged air of the courtroom. Then, finally, she spoke, calm, measured, absolute. "I think it means the system still works. That no matter how powerful someone believes they are, the truth will always catch up to them." Lawson exhaled sharply, but he said nothing. The judge's chair remained empty. But now, it didn't matter. This trial was no longer under his control. From the prosecution's table, one of Bondi's associates leaned in, lowering his voice. This might be the right time to offer a deal. Bondi considered it. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury watched, the way every person in attendance was holding their breath, waiting. They had just witnessed something they would never forget. But she had no intention of ending this quietly. She rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she began, then paused. She corrected herself. "Who will be presiding over this case?" She looked up at the judge's bench, where the replacement judge was preparing to take over. "I formally request that we proceed with additional evidence. Given today's revelations, it is clear that we need a full investigation into the extent of this corruption." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. She continued. "Judge Gates was only one part of the problem. If my team was able to uncover this, it means there are more. People who believed they were untouchable." She turned back to Robert Lawson. "So, I'll ask you again. Do you want to talk?" He sat motionless, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. He was weighing his options. Then, finally, he let out a long breath. "If I talk, I want protection." Bondi gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then you'd better start now." The courtroom was no longer the same. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that once shielded the powerful had begun to crack. And Pam Bondi had just sent a message to everyone watching. No one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the proceedings prepared to continue, reporters in the back scrambled to write, sending out the first headlines. This was no longer just a trial. This was history. And this was only the beginning. This story is a reminder that no one stands above the law and that, in the end, the truth will always come to light. If you were Pam Bondi, would you have the courage to take on an entire system of power to fight for justice? Have you ever stood up against injustice, knowing it could put you at risk? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire others. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of integrity and accountability. Thank you for watching. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the truth and fight for a fairer society. Wishing you strength and success. Thank you for supporting the channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any specific individual or organization. They are shared to promote valuable lessons in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If any inaccuracies are found, please accept our apologies with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.